Hey everyone, I'm Alicia, and in this video, I'm going to be breaking down the full story of how I got my junior summer internship at Blackstone. By the end of this video, you'll know the 3 specific things that I believe won me my offer, as well as 2 counterintuitive pieces of advice that no one really talks about, but that I think makes a big difference. So if you're a college student trying to break into finance, this video is for you. So a little bit about me, I attended Northwestern University where I was studying economics. And one of the main reasons why I decided to study econ in the first place was because I felt like it was one of the only classes that I had taken that actually tries to explain the real world. How money moves, how markets work, how businesses operate, and so naturally I was hooked. I also grew up partially abroad, and a lot of my classmates' parents worked in finance or business, and so that also contributed to my interest. And then I also consider myself a quantitative and qualitative person, and so I thought econ would be a good balance of the 2. Now, when I actually got to college, I really wasn't expecting how pre-professional it was going to feel. I really felt like every single person that I had met my freshman year was aligned to a career track, whether it was medicine, computer science, law. So obviously I felt the same pressure to align myself with the track, and given I was already studying econ, finance and business seemed like the most obvious fit. And I did what any ambitious freshman would do at the time. I decided to apply to as many business clubs and finance clubs that I could find on campus, but unfortunately got rejected from all of them. So I'd say that put a pretty abrupt end to my career exploration during my freshman year, but I felt that I had a lot of time, and so instead decided to focus on academics, extracurriculars, as well as my social life. And then my sophomore year, I also decided that I wanted to try something different than econ, just to make sure that, I was studying the thing that I was most interested in. So I took 2 classes in computer science. And while I did enjoy these classes, I definitely felt like I was being pushed out of my comfort zone. And so I just decided to double down on econ. And then something shifted towards the end of sophomore year where I felt like everyone that was an econ major was all of a sudden talking about consulting or banking recruiting. And so naturally, I felt that those were my only 2 options and that I'd have to pick one sooner or later, and ultimately decided that I would go the banking route. So why banking? I had 3 specific reasons. First was I wanted a global career, and banking seemed like the most actionable path that would allow me to achieve that. Second, I had heard a lot about the exit ops. The truth is, I still didn't know what I wanted to do in my career, and so I thought picking a path that preserved maximum optionality was the smartest thing to do. The last reason, which isn't about banking specifically, but I really wanted to approach recruiting strategically. At Northwestern, it seemed like the majority of econ students actually were going for the top consulting firms, and I thought that if I did banking, I would be competing against less Northwestern students and that my odds might be a little bit better. So I had my direction, and now I needed to build my foundation that would actually make me competitive in this process. So from my perspective, I think there are 2 main things that separate the students that get looks from the ones that don't. And it boils down to work experience and alumni network access. So on work experience, I was lucky enough to have both a freshman and sophomore summer internship. Now, I'm gonna be honest about how I got both of these. My freshman summer internship came through a connection that my uncle had with a real estate advisory firm in Hong Kong. And so that secured me my first internship during college. And then for my sophomore year, my younger brother's friend's dad had a small real estate private equity firm. I actually had already interned with them during high school through an internship program that was run by my school. And so I thought to just reach back out and see if they had any opportunities available in the US. And lucky for me, they did. So in full transparency, I used the network that I had available to me to get both of those internships. But the reason why I'm making this point is because I think students underestimate the network that they have even at such a young age. And so I really recommend being proactive and really just trying to leverage existing connections that you have to try and land something for your early college internships, given that pipelines to high caliber roles are just way less available. And I didn't know this at the time, but those 2 real estate internships ended up being the backbone of my narrative that ultimately landed me my offer at Blackstone. And then on the alumni network side, I did apply to one last club my sophomore year, and this was the investment banking club. I think that my acceptance into this club definitely helped me solidify that this was the recruiting path that I was going to go down. Not only do they provide you with some step-by-step guidance of how to go through the process, but more importantly, they give you access to former Northwestern alumni that used to be in the same club that now had investment banking jobs on Wall Street. And I knew that if I could reach out to these alumni saying that I was in that exact same club, that would give me instant credibility and dramatically increase response rates to my networking emails. And I know a lot of people say that if you're not in certain finance clubs, it makes recruiting nearly impossible. I would say that I don't agree with that, but for me, in my process, it definitely played a role in allowing me to be successful. And then one of the things that I did after I got accepted into that club was that I started reaching out to seniors who were still at Northwestern, who were also a part of the investment banking club, who had already accepted full-time offers to start working on Wall Street. And so those conversations really allowed me to get used to networking before I started taking calls with alumni that were a few years out of college. And so I highly recommend that anyone going through this process speak to upperclassmen that are taking full-time offers, because also they can provide you guidance with who to reach out to and give you some tips when it comes to networking with those specific individuals from the companies that they're joining. So before recruiting kicked off junior fall, I spent my summer in between my sophomore and junior years continuing to set myself up. So the first thing that I did was I intentionally decided to focus only on recruiting for firms in New York City. I highly recommend doing this just because it makes the networking process a lot more manageable. And then also it gave me a clear narrative as to why I wanted to work in New York, which was a question that often came up in interviews. So it's something that worked for me, definitely not a mandatory requirement, but that was just how I decided to approach my own process. The second thing is I attended an investment banking trek that was organized by the Northwestern Career Center. This was super helpful because it allowed me to kind of compare the bulge brackets to the elite boutiques and figure out which firms might be a better fit for my personality based on what I was looking for as well. And then also, more importantly, I got introduced to Blackstone through this trek. I honestly didn't really know much about them and hadn't really heard of them before, but after visiting the firm through this career trek, I definitely walked away with a really good impression and definitely a desire to work there. The next thing that I remember from that summer was through my mentor that I got assigned in the investment banking club. He called me one night just to tell me that my resume was not going to cut it. And he was kind enough to put me in touch with a mentor of his who was already a full-time investment banking analyst. He took the time to give me a call and then iterate with me on my resume until it passed his resume screening check. So really grateful for all the mentors that I had throughout this process. I highly, highly recommend that you try and get one or two upperclassmen in your court, because ultimately they were the ones that just went through the process and they can give you the most hands-on advice, as well as empathize with you given they just went through the process and they understand how stressful it can be. Okay, so now it's junior fall and recruiting is in full swing. Before I go into the processes that I went through, I just wanted to give two pieces of advice in terms of how I set up my recruiting process that I think definitely made a difference in allowing me to have the success that I did. So the first thing that I highly recommend is taking as light of a course load as you can during the semester that you're going through the recruiting process. Recruiting is definitely one of those things where the more time and effort you're able to put into it, the more you'll get out of it. It also takes up a huge mental load. And so if you're really able to minimize academics, it allows you more capacity to focus on recruiting. And I think that that allows you to have better outcomes. Number 2 is I highly recommend operating in isolation. I really just stayed in my own lane and didn't pay attention to anyone else's process. The process is pretty long and I did face rejection throughout. And so I know that if I was focusing on other people who had already gotten their offers, I think that probably would have further discouraged me and prevented me from keeping the attitude that I needed to in order to completely finish out the process, which probably took a total of 3 months for me. And now into the actual process. So depending on whether you're a target or semi-target, a lot of the firms will host info sessions on campus. So I definitely recommend going to all of those. That's exactly what I did. And I definitely think it's more of a tick the box on the part of the firm when they're making sure that they're picking students that have actually engaged with them and shown interest in their firm. And while I would say these info sessions aren't the most enjoyable given the ratio of students to professionals, I definitely tried to make the most of it by asking really thoughtful questions and trying to differentiate myself from the other students there. And I definitely think that through this, I was able to land some first rounds. I also spent a lot of the fall networking. But here's the thing, I actually went back and checked how many people I reached out to, how many networking calls I had, and it was way lower than what I would have expected. I only reached out to about 40 people and I probably had around 15 calls. So I'm a big believer that networking is more about quality over quantity. I definitely think that I've heard students having calls with 60 to 70 people, but I'm in the camp that you only need to have 1 or 2 good calls at a select number of firms, preferably firms that you think that you'd fit with personality-wise. So now switching to the results that I experienced, I was first admitted to 2 women's programs for PJT and JP Morgan, both in New York. And at the time, these women programs had embedded super days. So you would attend the program for one day and then the second would be the actual super day. So for PJT, I was waitlisted. This was the first super day I'd done. So definitely was just getting accustomed to the interviewing process. And I'll definitely break down what my super days were like in a different video. And for JP Morgan, I was rejected after that super day. PJT ended up giving me a call a few weeks later to re-super day me, so they flew me back out to New York, but unfortunately was rejected after the second time as well. I then received a super day for Goldman, so now this is my 4th time flying out to New York, and I was definitely a bit nervous given the name brand, and unfortunately I think that also got to my head a little bit, and I stumbled in one of my interviews, and so I didn't get that offer either. So at this point, I had been rejected technically 4 times. I was feeling pretty demoralized and questioning, whether I belonged in investment banking and if I was doing all the right things that I needed to be successful in the process. But one of the earliest lessons that my parents taught me was the power of resilience and to take every failure, reflect on it, and improve based on what you think you could have done better. And so I decided that I was going to keep going through the process and see if I could land anything else and just take every single failure as a lesson that I could then incorporate to be better in the next round. I would also remind myself constantly to keep a good perspective going into this process because it was still just my junior fall and I still had time to figure out an alternative in case this investment banking path didn't work. So keeping resilience and perspective in mind is what allowed me to carry on. When I'd made that decision to keep going, That's exactly when I received my Blackstone Super Day. I had already had first rounds with both the debt and the equity teams, and so I ended up receiving Super Days for both. So I flew to New York for the 5th time, and going into the Super Day, I knew that this was my final shot at landing an offer at a top firm on Wall Street. I had no other firms on the horizon, and it was basically do or die. And lucky enough, a few days after the Super Day, I got a call from one of the partners offering me the summer internship position with their real estate debt team. And of course, I accepted on the spot. So when I look back on why I think I was successful in that final Super Day that I had, I really think it boils down to 3 main things. So the first was my narrative. As I mentioned earlier, I had already had 2 previous internships in real estate, and I really think that moved the needle for me in allowing me to create a narrative that demonstrated that I actually was interested in real estate and I understood what I was getting into and that I wanted to continue to build my career in that. When you're going into an interview, so much of what interviewers are looking for is to be convinced that you want to be there and you've thought it through and that you've taken the necessary steps to actually explore that interest beyond just through academics or extracurriculars. Second, my attitude and my confidence. I really walked into that Super Day feeling like I had nothing to lose. Counterintuitively, after 4 rejections, I felt that the pressure had lifted. Instead of putting the pressure on myself that I needed to get this internship offer, I approached the Super Day with the mindset of what a cool opportunity to visit this firm and speak to different people to not only talk about myself, but also learn more about their background and their careers and why they enjoy real estate. This mindset shift really carried me through the Super Day, and I definitely think people could sense that type of energy that I was giving off versus previously going into Super Days with definitely a lot more fear. And third was my level of preparedness. At this point, I had done 4 in-person Super Days. I had had enough data points to reflect on what questions were most likely to come up, and so I made sure that I had really prepared those and practiced those out loud and refined my delivery. Reps really is everything when it comes to feeling confident and delivering responses that feel natural in an interview. And here's the thing I want you to remember above everything else. There are 2 things that you're trying to achieve in every interview that you will ever take. The first is likability, and the second is demonstrated capability. Be someone that they want to work with and prove that you can do the job. So that's the full story of how I landed my offer at Blackstone. If you're a freshman or sophomore and you're interested in finance, I've put a free pre-recruiting checklist in the link below that breaks down exactly what you need to be doing between now and when recruiting kicks off your sophomore fall. The link is in the description and it's completely free, so please go grab it. I spent 4 out of my 6 years at Blackstone running recruiting for my team, and in this channel, I'm going to break down everything that I learned. What works, what doesn't work, and what I'd do differently if I were starting from scratch today. So if this interests you, please subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you in the next video where I'm going to break down a month-by-month roadmap of what the recruiting process looks like your sophomore year, all the way from networking to applications to interviews.